Have you ever looked at someone and thought you knew exactly who they were, only to discover you were catastrophically wrong? Have you ever underestimated a person so completely that it cost you everything? Before we begin this incredible story, I need your help. Comment below where you're watching from, your city, your state, your country. This channel survives because of viewers like you who care about preserving these hidden chapters of history. Hit that subscribe button right now because YouTube doesn't promote this kind of content, and we need your support to keep sharing these secret stories that changed America forever. The morning of October 5th, 1813, dawned cold and gray over the Thames River Valley in Upper Canada. Major General Henry Proctor of the British Army stood on a small rise, surveying the battlefield before him with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. His force numbered over 1,000 British regulars, some of the finest soldiers in the world, disciplined and battle-hardened from years of warfare across the European continent. Behind them, stretching into the forest, were approximately 500 Native American warriors, though Proctor paid them little mind. Among those warriors stood a man who would change everything. His name was Tecumseh, and to the British officers who glanced his way that morning, he appeared utterly unremarkable. At 45 years old, he stood of medium height, perhaps 5 feet 10 inches, with a lean frame that suggested neither particular strength nor physical prowess. His clothing was simple deerskin and cloth, adorned with minimal decoration. His face, weathered by decades of outdoor life, showed no fierce war paint, no fearsome markings. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured. Everything about his appearance suggested a man of peace, perhaps a village elder or a spiritual leader, certainly not a warrior who had spent 3 decades fighting for his people's survival. General Proctor had made a critical error that morning. He had looked at Tecumseh and seen exactly what he expected to see. A primitive ally, useful perhaps for scouting and minor skirmishes, but hardly a military asset worth considering in his battle plans. The British commander had positioned his regular troops in the center, where the real fighting would occur. The native warriors, including Tecumseh and his men, were relegated to the flanks, almost an afterthought in Proctor's grand strategy. What Proctor could not see, what he had failed to learn in the months they had fought alongside each other, was that Tecumseh was perhaps the most brilliant tactical mind on the North American continent. The Shawnee chief had been studying warfare since he was a boy of 6, when he witnessed his father's death at the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774. For nearly 4 decades, he had fought in countless engagements, observed every strategy, learned from every victory and defeat. He had fought against American militias in the Ohio Valley, against federal troops in the Northwest Territory, and had developed a military philosophy that combined Native American guerrilla tactics with conventional European-style warfare in ways no one had ever attempted. But none of this showed on his face that morning. He appeared, as he always did, calm and unassuming. Across the battlefield, American forces under Major General William Henry Harrison were advancing. Harrison commanded approximately 3,000 troops, a massive numerical advantage that seemed to guarantee American victory. His cavalry, under Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, numbered over 1,000 mounted soldiers, an overwhelming force that should have been able to simply ride down any opposition. The Americans were confident, almost jubilant. They had chased the British and their native allies for days, and now, finally, they would end this campaign with a decisive victory. Harrison had heard of Tecumseh, of course. Intelligence reports mentioned him as a native leader who had been organizing various tribes into a confederacy. But like Proctor, Harrison saw what he expected to see: another tribal chief, probably skilled at forest ambushes and raids, but no match for organized military power. The reports Harrison received described Tecumseh as soft-spoken, diplomatic, even philosophical. One American officer who had met him during peace negotiations years earlier had written that Tecumseh seemed more like a scholar than a warrior, more interested in ideas than battle. They were all catastrophically wrong. As the American forces began their advance, Tecumseh moved among his warriors with quiet efficiency. He spoke no rousing speeches, made no dramatic gestures. He simply positioned his men with the precision of a chess master placing pieces on a board. To the British officers watching, it looked like random movement, native warriors spreading out into the forest on the right flank. They paid it no attention. But Tecumseh was creating something extraordinary. He had observed the terrain for hours the previous night, noting every tree, every rise in the ground, every line of sight and angle of approach. He had studied how Harrison's cavalry would move, where they would commit their forces, where their confidence would make them careless. And now he was setting a trap so sophisticated that the Americans would not realize they were in it until far too late. The British regular troops, formed in their traditional lines, looked impressive in their red coats and precise formations. They waited for the American advance with the steady confidence of professional soldiers. Proctor, watching from his command position, felt certain of victory. His regulars would hold the center, absorb the American assault, and then counterattack. It was textbook military doctrine, the kind taught at every military academy in Europe. But Tecumseh had never attended a military academy. He had learned warfare in a far harder school, where mistakes meant death and innovation meant survival. And he knew something that both Harrison and Proctor had failed to grasp. This battle would not be won by whoever had the most soldiers in the center. It would be won by whoever controlled the flanks, by whoever could turn the enemy's strength into a fatal weakness. The first shots rang out as American forces engaged the British center. The red-coated regulars returned fire with disciplined volleys, and for a few minutes it seemed as though Proctor's confidence was justified. The Americans were taking casualties, their advance slowing against the British firepower. Harrison, watching from his position, began committing more forces to the center, exactly as expected. That was when Tecumseh struck. His warriors erupted from the forest on the American right flank, not in the wild, disorganized charge that American forces expected from native fighters, but in a coordinated, devastating assault that hit multiple points simultaneously. Tecumseh had divided his force into smaller units, each with specific objectives, each attacking at precisely calculated moments. It was a tactic that would not be formally taught in Western military academies for another 50 years, but Tecumseh had intuited its power through decades of experience and observation. The American right flank collapsed almost instantly. Soldiers who had been confidently advancing suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions, unable to establish defensive positions, unable even to understand where the enemy was. Panic began to spread. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Units broke formation, trying to respond to threats that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Colonel Johnson, commanding the American cavalry, recognized the danger immediately. He wheeled his mounted troops toward the right flank, intending to use their superior mobility and firepower to smash through the native warriors and restore order. It was the tactically sound decision, the one any competent commander would make. It was also exactly what Tecumseh had anticipated. As Johnson's cavalry thundered toward the native positions, Tecumseh made a gesture so subtle that most people wouldn't even have noticed it. His warriors, who had been engaging the American infantry, suddenly melted back into the forest, not in retreat, but in a controlled withdrawal that drew the cavalry after them. Johnson, seeing the enemy apparently fleeing, pressed his advantage, driving his horsemen deeper into the woods. Tecumseh had turned the Americans' greatest strength into a fatal liability. Cavalry were devastating in open ground, but in dense forest, among trees and undergrowth, horses became obstacles rather than advantages. The American mounted soldiers found themselves channeled into narrow lanes between trees, unable to maneuver, unable to use their numbers effectively. And waiting for them, positioned with perfect precision, were Tecumseh's warriors. What happened next was a masterpiece of tactical warfare. Tecumseh's forces hit Johnson's cavalry from three sides simultaneously, not with wild attacks, but with coordinated fire and movement that shredded the American formation. Horses screamed and fell. Soldiers, trapped in the saddle, became easy targets. Officers died trying to rally their men. Within minutes, the cream of Harrison's cavalry force was reduced to chaos, scattered and broken in the dark forest. Johnson himself, leading from the front as brave officers did in that era, found himself facing Tecumseh directly. According to later accounts from both American and native sources, Johnson fired his pistol at the Shawnee chief from close range. Whether the shot hit Tecumseh remains a matter of historical debate, lost in the confusion and horror of that moment. What is certain is that Johnson's horse was shot from under him, and he crashed to the ground, seriously wounded. His second-in-command tried to extract him, and in the desperate fighting that followed, dozens of American soldiers died trying to save their fallen colonel. Meanwhile, at the British center, General Proctor was beginning to understand what was happening. The native warriors he had dismissed as primitive auxiliaries had just destroyed a significant portion of the American force and thrown Harrison's entire battle plan into disarray. The Americans, who had been attacking with confidence, were now fighting desperately on multiple fronts, unsure where the next threat would emerge. But Tecumseh was not finished. With the American right flank shattered and their cavalry broken, he shifted his focus. His warriors, moving with a coordination that seemed impossible for forces supposedly lacking formal military training, began a sweeping movement that threatened to encircle the entire American position. They did not charge blindly. They moved deliberately, maintaining formation, supporting each other, executing complex maneuvers that would have impressed any European military observer. Harrison, watching his battle plan disintegrate, made the hardest decision a commander can make. He ordered a fighting withdrawal. His troops, still numbering more than the combined British and native forces, began pulling back in relatively good order, using their numerical superiority to cover each other's retreat. But they were retreating, and everyone on that battlefield knew what it meant. A force of 3,000 American soldiers, with superior numbers, superior equipment, and every tactical advantage, had been beaten by a combined force half their size. And the deciding factor had been one man whom everyone had underestimated, one quiet, unassuming warrior whom British and Americans alike had looked at and seen nothing to fear. Tecumseh stood on the battlefield that evening as the Americans withdrew, his face still showing no particular emotion, his voice still calm as he directed his warriors in securing the field. To anyone watching, he still appeared unremarkable, just another tribal leader. But in the hours that followed, as word of the battle spread, both sides would begin to understand what they had witnessed. The Americans had not just lost a battle. They had encountered something far more dangerous. A military genius who looked nothing like what they expected a military genius to look like. Tecumseh had taken every assumption they made about native warfare, about his own capabilities, about how battles should be fought, and turned those assumptions into weapons against them. In his journal that night, one American officer who survived the battle wrote a passage that would later become famous. I have quoted it here exactly as it appears in the archives of the Ohio Historical Society. We expected savages and found soldiers. We expected chaos and found strategy. We expected a primitive foe and found a commander who would have ranked among the finest generals in any army in the world. Chief Tecumseh appeared harmless until he led the charge that shattered our lines, and in doing so, shattered every conception we held about warfare on this continent. But this was only the beginning of Tecumseh's story, and the true extent of his military genius would only become apparent in the weeks and months that followed. What happened at the Thames River was not an isolated victory or a lucky break. It was a demonstration of capabilities that would force the United States military to completely rethink how they approached warfare with native forces. The implications of that October day would ripple across the continent for decades. American military strategists would study what happened at Thames River, trying to understand how their overwhelming advantages had been negated so completely. British commanders would reassess their native allies, recognizing too late the extraordinary military talent they had failed to utilize effectively. And Tecumseh himself would become something far more than just another tribal leader in American consciousness. He would become the warrior who proved that appearance means nothing, that underestimating your enemy based on how they look or how they speak is a fatal error, and that true military genius transcends culture, formal training, and every assumption about who can and cannot command armies. In the days following the Battle of the Thames River, something unprecedented began to happen across the American frontier. Military couriers rode hard from fort to fort, carrying urgent dispatches that all contained variations of the same alarming message. Tecumseh was not what they had believed. The quiet, unassuming chief, who had seemed so reasonable in diplomatic meetings, so philosophical in his speeches about native unity, was in fact orchestrating a military campaign of such sophistication that it threatened to completely destabilize American expansion into the Northwest Territory. Intelligence reports that had once dismissed Tecumseh as merely another tribal leader were now being frantically revised. Officers who had met him began recalling details they had overlooked. The way his eyes constantly assessed terrain during negotiations, how his questions about American military movements had seemed idle curiosity but were actually precise intelligence gathering, how his calm demeanor had masked a mind constantly calculating angles of attack and lines of retreat. At Fort Detroit, Colonel Lewis Cass sat in his office late into the night, surrounded by maps and reports, trying to piece together the full scope of what they were facing. Cass had been in the Ohio Valley for 15 years, had fought in dozens of engagements with various native tribes, and considered himself an expert on frontier warfare. Now, studying the pattern of attacks and movements over the past 3 years, he realized with growing horror that every engagement, every skirmish, every seemingly random raid had been part of a larger strategy that he had completely failed to recognize. Tecumseh had not been reacting to American expansion. He had been actively shaping it, channeling American forces into specific areas, drawing them away from others, creating conditions that would allow his Confederacy to grow stronger while appearing weaker. The Battle of Thames River had not been a desperate stand by cornered warriors. It had been a calculated demonstration, a message delivered in blood and tactics that the rules of frontier warfare had fundamentally changed. But understanding Tecumseh's genius was one thing. Stopping him was something else entirely. In the winter of 1813, as snow blanketed the Ohio Valley, Tecumseh launched a campaign that would cement his reputation as one of the most dangerous military minds America had ever faced. He began hitting American supply lines with strikes so precisely timed and positioned that entire columns would vanish without a trace, their goods redistributed to native villages, their soldiers either dead or captured. What made these attacks particularly terrifying was their intelligence. Tecumseh always seemed to know which convoys carried the most valuable supplies, which were most lightly defended, which routes would take soldiers through terrain where rescue would be impossible. American commanders became convinced there must be spies within their own ranks, feeding information to the enemy. They were partially correct, but what they failed to understand was that Tecumseh had created an intelligence network that spanned hundreds of miles, using trusted warriors, sympathetic traders, and carefully cultivated sources to build a picture of American military movements that was often more accurate than what the Americans themselves possessed. A letter from Captain William Wells to the War Department, dated December 18, 1813, now preserved in the National Archives, captures the growing desperation. "We are not fighting savages. We are fighting an organized military force under the command of a leader whose tactical abilities exceed those of many of our own generals. Chief Tecumseh has transformed what should have been scattered raids into a coordinated campaign that threatens our entire position in the Northwest Territory. Every assumption we made about native warfare has proven fatally wrong. We are losing this war because we refuse to see who we were really fighting." But Tecumseh's brilliance extended far beyond the battlefield. He understood something that most military commanders of his era missed. Wars are not won just by defeating armies, but by breaking the enemy's will to fight. Throughout the winter, he orchestrated a psychological campaign that was perhaps even more devastating than his military one. American settlers began abandoning their claims and fleeing east, not because native warriors had attacked them directly, but because the reputation of what Tecumseh could do had created a terror that no number of soldiers could dispel. Stories spread through frontier communities, each one more unsettling than the last. A military patrol that had vanished without a trace, found weeks later, their bodies arranged in formations that suggested they had been outmaneuvered by a force they never even saw. A fort that had been deemed impregnable, its garrison discovered one morning to find that native warriors had somehow infiltrated during the night, taken supplies from the storehouse, and left without waking a single sentry. It was as if Tecumseh and his warriors could move like ghosts, appearing and disappearing at will, always one step ahead of any American response. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who had eagerly signed up for frontier service began deserting in increasing numbers. Officers who had built their careers on fighting native tribes found themselves facing an enemy they could not predict, could not counter, could not even properly understand. The United States Army, the most powerful military force in the Western Hemisphere, was being systematically dismantled by a warrior who had never attended West Point, never studied European military theory, never commanded anything that Europeans would recognize as a proper army. In Washington, President James Madison received increasingly alarming reports. The Northwest Territory, which was supposed to be secure American territory, was becoming ungovernable. The British, still reeling from their own underestimation of Tecumseh, had begun pouring more resources into supporting his Confederacy, recognizing belatedly that they had a military asset of incalculable value. The war that everyone had expected to be a quick American victory was turning into a prolonged nightmare, and at the center of it all was one man whom nobody had taken seriously until it was too late. But who was this man, really? As American intelligence officers compiled dossiers on Tecumseh, trying to understand how they had missed the signs of his abilities, a more complex picture began to emerge. He had been born in March of 1768 near present-day Springfield, Ohio, during a period of intense conflict between native tribes and American settlers. His father, Puckashinwau, had been a Shawnee war chief who died fighting at Point Pleasant when Tecumseh was only 6 years old. That battle, which saw Shawnee warriors nearly defeat a much larger force of Virginia militia, had been young Tecumseh's first lesson in how tactical brilliance could overcome numerical inferiority. But unlike many warriors who became defined by revenge for fallen family members, Tecumseh had approached warfare as something to be studied, understood, and perfected. His older brother, Cheesecow, had taken over his education, teaching him not just how to fight, but how to think about fighting. According to tribal histories and accounts from warriors who trained alongside him, Tecumseh was obsessed with understanding why battles were won or lost. He would interview survivors from both sides of conflicts, asking detailed questions about positioning, timing, decision-making. He studied captured American military manuals through interpreters, absorbing European tactical doctrine while recognizing its limitations. By his 20s, Tecumseh had already participated in dozens of engagements and had begun developing his own military philosophy. He recognized that native warriors possessed advantages that American troops could not match: intimate knowledge of terrain, ability to move through forests silently, superb marksmanship, and a flexibility in tactics that rigid European-style formations lacked. But he also recognized native weaknesses: lack of discipline in prolonged engagements, tendency toward individualistic heroics rather than coordinated action, and insufficient attention to logistics and supply. What made Tecumseh extraordinary was his ability to combine the strengths of both approaches while minimizing the weaknesses. He began training warriors in formations and coordinated movements, but formations adapted to forest warfare rather than open-field battles. He emphasized discipline and following commands, but within a framework that still allowed for individual initiative and adaptability. He studied supply lines and logistics with the same intensity that European officers did, understanding that armies moved on their stomachs and that controlling resources was as important as winning battles. Perhaps most revolutionary was his approach to intelligence and reconnaissance. Tecumseh built a network of scouts and informants that would have impressed any spy master in Europe. He cultivated relationships with traders who could move freely between native and American settlements, gathering information without raising suspicion. He placed observers near every major American fort and settlement, using relay systems to get information back to him with remarkable speed. When American commanders made plans, Tecumseh often knew about them before those plans could be executed. And yet, despite all this sophistication, despite decades of military experience and proven genius, Tecumseh continued to appear unremarkable to those who met him. He dressed simply, spoke softly, showed no arrogance or bravado. American officers who negotiated with him during brief truces came away consistently underestimating him, seeing only what they expected to see. Another tribal leader, articulate perhaps, but surely no military threat. Even after the disaster at Thames River, even after the winter campaign of 1813 had demonstrated his capabilities beyond any doubt, American commanders continued to make the fatal error of believing that Tecumseh's success must be luck, or circumstance, or anything other than what it actually was: superior tactical and strategic thinking. This cognitive dissonance, this inability to reconcile Tecumseh's appearance with his achievements, would prove catastrophic. In the spring of 1814, Major General Andrew Jackson was assigned to lead a new campaign against Tecumseh's Confederacy. Jackson, who would later become president, was known for his aggressive tactics and his absolute confidence in American military superiority. He reviewed the reports of Tecumseh's previous victories and reportedly dismissed them as exaggerations, the product of incompetent commanders making excuses for their failures. Jackson's plan was brutally simple: overwhelming force applied with ruthless efficiency. He would gather an army so large that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome it. march directly into the heart of Tecumseh's territory and crush the native Confederacy through sheer military might. It was the kind of plan that looked perfect on paper, the kind that military academies taught as doctrine. It was also exactly the kind of plan that Tecumseh had been preparing to counter for years. When Jackson's army, numbering over 4,000 troops, began its march in April of 1814, Tecumseh did something that no one expected. He retreated. His warriors melted away before the American advance, avoiding battle, disappearing into the forests and swamps of the Northwest Territory. Jackson, interpreting this as cowardice or weakness, pressed forward aggressively, confident that he was on the verge of decisive victory. His officers shared his confidence. Finally, they believed they were facing Tecumseh on their terms, with overwhelming force that would end this war once and for all. They were marching into the most sophisticated trap ever constructed in North American warfare. Over the previous 6 months, while American attention had been focused elsewhere, Tecumseh had been preparing the battlefield. He had mapped every trail, every river crossing, every choke point in his territory. He had pre-positioned supplies in hidden caches that would allow his warriors to operate for weeks without returning to their villages. He had identified every position where terrain would negate American numerical advantages. And now, as Jackson's massive army lumbered deeper into hostile territory, Tecumseh began to execute a campaign that would be studied in military academies for generations. The first attacks came at dawn on April 23rd, hitting Jackson's supply train far behind the main army. Tecumseh's warriors struck with perfect coordination, overwhelming the guards, seizing wagons loaded with ammunition and food, and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. Jackson was furious but unconcerned. He had plenty of supplies, and his main force was intact. He continued his advance. The next attack came 2 days later, targeting a different section of the supply line. Then another, and another. Each strike was executed with precision, hitting at times and places that suggested Tecumseh knew Jackson's movements before Jackson himself did. The American general's confidence began to waver. His massive army was bleeding supplies, and the enemy they were supposed to be crushing remained invisible, striking from the shadows and disappearing before any effective response could be mounted. Jackson made the decision to abandon his supply line and march directly to where intelligence reports suggested Tecumseh's main encampment was located. It would be risky, but if he could force a decisive battle, he could end this with one overwhelming victory. His army, still numbering over 3,500 combat-ready troops, began a rapid advance toward the reported native positions. They were marching into empty forest. Tecumseh's encampment, when Jackson's scouts finally located it, had been abandoned days earlier. But the retreat had been carefully staged. Deliberate trails led away from the camp, trails that seemed to show a force fleeing in disarray. Jackson, seeing his enemy apparently on the run, ordered his tired, hungry troops to pursue. That was when Tecumseh revealed the true depth of his strategic thinking. The trails did not lead to fleeing warriors. They led to a series of interconnected killing zones that Tecumseh had been preparing for months. Narrow passages between cliffs where cavalry could not maneuver. Swamps where wagons would bog down. Forests so dense that maintaining formation was impossible. And waiting at each of these locations, perfectly positioned and supplied, were Tecumseh's warriors. The running battle that followed would last for 5 days and cover over 60 miles of wilderness. Jackson's army, divided into multiple columns to pursue the supposedly fleeing enemy, found themselves fighting separate engagements simultaneously, unable to support each other, unable even to maintain clear communication. Tecumseh's forces appeared and disappeared like phantoms, hitting weak points, avoiding strong ones, inflicting casualties while refusing to commit to pitched battle. It was mobile warfare of a sophistication that would not be seen again on the North American continent until the 20th century. By the time Jackson managed to consolidate his scattered forces, he had lost over 800 men killed, wounded, or captured, nearly a quarter of his army, and he still had not managed to engage Tecumseh's main force in the decisive battle he craved. His troops were exhausted, demoralized, and running dangerously low on supplies. The mighty American army that was supposed to crush native resistance once and for all was now fighting desperately just to survive and extract itself from enemy territory. Jackson, in his official report to the War Department dated May 5, 1814, was forced to write words that must have burned like acid. "We have been outgeneraled by an enemy we did not respect. Chief Tecumseh has demonstrated military capabilities that exceed anything we anticipated. This campaign has been a disaster, and responsibility falls entirely on my shoulders for underestimating the enemy based on prejudiced assumptions about Native American military capacity. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire campaign was what happened as Jackson's battered army retreated. Tecumseh could have pursued, could have potentially destroyed the American force completely. His warriors urged him to press the attack, to drive the invaders from their territory once and for all. Instead, Tecumseh ordered a measured pursuit that maintained pressure but avoided the decisive engagement that Jackson was now desperately seeking. It was as if he understood that completely annihilating Jackson's army might force the United States to commit even more resources to the conflict, while simply humiliating them and forcing their retreat accomplished his strategic objectives more effectively. This level of strategic restraint, of understanding not just how to win battles, but how victories fit into larger political and military contexts, was something that even most European commanders of the era struggled with. That it came from a leader whom American society had dismissed as a primitive savage made it all the more devastating to American military pride. News of Jackson's defeat spread rapidly, and the myth of inevitable American expansion suddenly seemed far less certain. Settlers who had been pushing into the Northwest Territory began abandoning their claims in huge numbers. Military recruitment, which had relied on promises of easy victories over inferior opponents, dried up as potential soldiers realized they might be facing an enemy more dangerous than anything in their nightmares. In the halls of Congress, furious debates erupted about how the most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere could be losing a war to what politicians had repeatedly characterized as disorganized native tribes. Some congressmen called for massive military escalation, for armies numbering in the tens of thousands to simply overwhelm the Northwest Territory through sheer force of numbers. Others, recognizing the catastrophic expense such a campaign would entail, began seriously discussing negotiated peace settlements that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. And at the center of all these debates, all this recalculation of American strategy and policy, was one man whom nobody had taken seriously, one quiet warrior whose unremarkable appearance had hidden a military mind that was reshaping the future of the continent. Tecumseh had not just won battles. He had forced the United States to confront the possibility that their expansion westward was not inevitable, that there were forces and leaders capable of stopping them, and that underestimating your enemy based on appearance or prejudice was not just unwise, but potentially fatal. But wars are not won by brilliant tactics alone. They require resources, allies, and sustainable strategies that can be maintained over years rather than months. Tecumseh understood this, and even as American forces reeled from their defeats, he knew that time was not entirely on his side. The British support that had been crucial to his Confederacy's success was becoming increasingly unreliable as the War of 1812 dragged on and British attention focused elsewhere. The various tribes in his confederacy, inspired by recent victories, were also becoming restless, eager for more aggressive action that might jeopardize the careful strategic approach Tecumseh favored. In September of 1814, Tecumseh called a great council of all the tribes in his confederacy. Warriors and chiefs gathered from across the Northwest Territory, from the Great Lakes to the Ohio River, representing dozens of distinct peoples united under his leadership. What Tecumseh told them at that council remains a matter of historical debate, as no complete written record survives. But fragments of his speech, preserved in oral traditions and partial accounts written by those present, suggest that he was preparing his people for a long struggle, one that would test not just their military strength, but their unity and resolve. One Shawnee elder who was present later recounted to missionaries a portion of what Tecumseh said, and those words were recorded in the archives of the Methodist Episcopal Church, now housed at Drew University. I have quoted it exactly as it appears in those documents. We have shown them that we are not what they believed. We have proven that courage and skill are not the exclusive possessions of any race or people. But this war will not be won by battles alone. It will be won by our ability to remain united when they try to divide us, to remain strong when they offer us temporary comforts, to remember who we are and what we fight for even when the path seems darkest. But even as Tecumseh spoke those words, forces were aligning that would test whether his brilliance could overcome the sheer weight of resources and manpower that the United States could ultimately bring to bear. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in December of 1814, would end the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain. But it would also mean that British support for native resistance would evaporate. Tecumseh would be left to face American power essentially alone, and no amount of tactical genius could indefinitely overcome that fundamental imbalance. The final confrontation came in October of 1815, almost exactly 2 years after the Battle of Thames River that had first revealed Tecumseh's capabilities to a shocked American military establishment. A new American army, commanded by Major General Edmund Gaines and numbering over 5,000 troops, advanced into the Northwest Territory with orders to end the native Confederacy once and for all. This time, the Americans were not underestimating their enemy. They moved cautiously, maintained tight security, and were prepared for exactly the kind of sophisticated tactics that Tecumseh had demonstrated repeatedly. Tecumseh, commanding a force of approximately 800 warriors, the last remnant of his once mighty Confederacy, faced an impossible decision. He could retreat, disappear into the wilderness, continue a guerrilla campaign that might last for years, but could never achieve final victory. Or he could stand and fight, knowing that defeat was almost certain, but that the manner of that defeat might inspire future generations. He chose to fight. On October 13, 1815, on a field near present-day Fort Wayne, Indiana, Tecumseh led his warriors in what would be his final battle. The Americans, even expecting his tactics, even prepared for his genius, were still shocked by what they encountered. Tecumseh's small force fought with a discipline and coordination that would have impressed any European army, executing complex maneuvers under fire, maintaining formation even as casualties mounted, refusing to break even when any rational assessment said they should. For 6 hours, 800 native warriors held off an army 7 times their size. They made the Americans pay for every foot of ground in blood and courage. Gaines, watching from his command position, would later write in his official report that he had never seen, in 15 years of military service, a more professionally conducted defense or a more courageous stand against overwhelming odds. But courage and skill can only do so much against impossible odds. By late afternoon, Tecumseh's line was collapsing, his warriors dying around him, and the end was inevitable. According to multiple accounts from both sides, Tecumseh was seen in the final minutes of the battle, still directing his warriors, still fighting with the same calm determination he had shown throughout his life. An American soldier, Private Thomas Jefferson Carter, would later describe watching Tecumseh fall, struck by multiple shots. Carter's account, preserved in pension records at the National Archives, includes this passage: "He did not die like other men. Even in death, there was a dignity to him that made me ashamed to be among his killers. We had come to defeat savages, and instead, we had destroyed one of the finest soldiers any of us would ever face." The death of Tecumseh marked the end of organized native resistance in the Northwest Territory. Without his leadership, his strategic vision, and his ability to unite disparate tribes into a cohesive force, the Confederacy collapsed. Within months, American settlers were pouring into lands that had been held by native peoples for thousands of years. The expansion westward that Tecumseh had delayed and nearly stopped resumed with renewed vigor, and within a generation, the Northwest Territory would be entirely under American control. But Tecumseh's legacy extended far beyond military victories or defeats. He had forced the United States to confront uncomfortable truths about its own prejudices and assumptions. He had proven that military genius is not limited by race, formal education, or cultural background. He had demonstrated that underestimating an enemy based on how they look or speak is not just ethically wrong, but tactically suicidal. In the decades following his death, as the United States continued its expansion across the continent, military officers and historians would study Tecumseh's campaigns with growing respect. His tactics would be analyzed at West Point, his strategies discussed in military journals. Commanders facing native forces in later conflicts would be repeatedly warned not to make the same mistake earlier generations had made. Do not assume that because someone appears unremarkable, they are not dangerous. Yet despite this growing respect, despite the acknowledgement of his genius, there remained something deeply unsettling about Tecumseh's story that historians and military scholars have struggled to fully address. He should not have been as successful as he was. According to every theory of warfare taught in military academies, according to every principle of logistics and resources and industrial capacity, he should have been defeated quickly and decisively. But he wasn't. For years, this one man, leading forces that were outnumbered and outgunned, fought the most powerful military in the Western Hemisphere to a standstill and nearly stopped American expansion cold. This raises a question that continues to haunt military historians. How many others like Tecumseh were there? How many brilliant tactical minds were dismissed and underestimated because they did not fit European or American expectations of what a military leader should look like? How different might the history of this continent be if Tecumseh had been recognized for what he was earlier? If he had been given the resources and support that his genius deserved? If the British had actually listened to him rather than treating him as a primitive auxiliary? And perhaps more unsettling still, are there people walking among us today whose extraordinary capabilities we fail to recognize because they do not match our expectations? How many potential Tecumsehs have we overlooked because they appeared unremarkable, because they did not advertise their abilities with bravado and self-promotion, because they quietly did extraordinary things that we failed to notice? The story of Tecumseh is ultimately a story about the fatal danger of assumptions. It is a story about how easily we dismiss what we do not expect to find, how readily we overlook genius when it wears an unfamiliar face. It is a reminder that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who looks fearsome, but the one we fail to take seriously until far too late. And it should terrify us to realize how close Tecumseh came to succeeding, how nearly this one underestimated warrior changed the entire course of American history. If British support had been more reliable, if his Confederacy had held together a few more years, if any of a dozen different factors had shifted slightly in his favor, the map of North America might look entirely different today. The United States might have stopped at the Ohio River, blocked by a strong native confederacy led by a military genius whom nobody had taken seriously until he proved capable of beating the most powerful armies in the world. That is the true horror of Tecumseh's story. Not that he lost, but that he came so terrifyingly close to winning. And he nearly succeeded, because everyone made the same fundamental error. They looked at him and saw exactly what they expected to see. Nothing more. They saw a harmless-looking tribal leader and missed the military genius standing right in front of them. By the time they understood their mistake, thousands were already dead, and American expansion had been thrown into chaos for years. So perhaps the question we should be asking is not about Tecumseh, but about ourselves. Who are we underestimating right now? What dangers are we failing to recognize because they do not match our expectations? What genius are we overlooking because it wears an unfamiliar face? The story of Chief Tecumseh, the harmless-looking warrior who nearly stopped America's expansion, should serve as an eternal warning. Never assume that what you see is all there is. In times of uncertainty and darkness, when we face enemies we do not understand and challenges that seem insurmountable, there is only one source of true wisdom and strength. The Scriptures remind us that human wisdom is foolishness before God, and that our own understanding will always be limited by our earthly perspective. As Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 teach us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." Tecumseh fought with honor and courage, but the lessons of his life point us toward a greater truth, that we must humble ourselves before God, recognize our limitations, and seek divine guidance in all things. For only through Jesus Christ can we find the wisdom to see beyond appearances, the strength to face impossible odds, and the grace to treat all people with the dignity they deserve, regardless of how they may appear to our limited human vision. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. For he alone can open our eyes to what we cannot see, strengthen us when we are weak, and guide us when we are lost. The story of Tecumseh reminds us that human understanding fails, human prejudice blinds, and human pride destroys. But God's wisdom is eternal, his love unconditional, and through Christ we can find redemption from our errors and salvation for our souls.